The axe slipped from Willa Davidson's blistered hands for the third time that morning, clattering against the half-split log with a sound that made her want to scream in frustration. October sun beat down on her small homestead just outside Tucson, Arizona Territory, and winter would arrive faster than she could prepare. Her husband had been dead for 6 months now, taken by a rattlesnake bite that turned his leg black before the fever claimed him. At 22 years old, she found herself alone on 40 acres with a cabin that needed repairs, a vegetable garden struggling in the dry soil, and barely enough firewood to last through next week, let alone the cold months ahead. She bent to retrieve the axe, her back protesting the movement. The cotton dress she wore was already soaked through with sweat, and her blonde hair kept escaping from the bun she had tied it into that morning. The woodpile beside the cabin mocked her with its meager size. 3 days she had been at this, and she had so little to show for her efforts. "You are going to take your own foot off swinging like that." Willa spun around, nearly dropping the axe again. A man sat astride a paint horse not 20 feet away, and she wondered how long he had been watching her struggle. He was tall even in the saddle, wearing dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A bandana hung loose around his neck, and she could see dark hair curling at his collar. "I am managing just fine," she said, lifting her chin despite knowing it was an obvious lie. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. When he stepped closer and she could see his face properly, she estimated him to be perhaps 26 or 27, with green eyes that held a mixture of amusement and something gentler that might have been concern. His jaw was shadowed with a few days of stubble, and there was a kindness in his expression that made her defensive walls lower slightly. "I can see that," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice. "But I have some time today, and it would be no trouble to help." "I do not need charity," Willa said, even as another part of her wanted to weep with relief at the offer. "No, madam, I do not imagine you do, but neighborly help is not the same as charity. Name is Jackson Xavier. I have a ranch about 5 miles northwest of here. Been meaning to introduce myself since I heard about your loss. I am sorry about your husband." Willa studied him for a long moment. She had heard the name Xavier mentioned in town. The ranch had belonged to his father, who had died 2 years back, leaving it to his only son. People spoke well of Jackson Xavier, said he was fair in his dealings and honest in his word. "Willa Davidson," she finally said, "and I would be grateful for the help if you truly have the time to spare." Jackson nodded and began rolling up his sleeves. His forearms were tanned and corded with muscle from years of hard work. "You have enough timber here to split. The problem is not your wood supply but your technique. May I show you?" He positioned himself beside the chopping block, and Willa found herself watching the way he moved, economical and sure. "The axe does most of the work if you let it. You are fighting against it instead of working with it. Watch the weight of the head, let it fall." When he brought the axe down, the log split cleanly in two with a sound like a gunshot. He made it look effortless. "The wood is too green in some of these pieces," Jackson observed, examining her pile. "You need seasoned wood for winter, dried at least 6 months. I have timber on my land that has been drying for near on a year. Would you allow me to bring some over?" "I cannot pay you," Willa said quietly, shame heating her cheeks. "I did not ask for payment. Like I said, this is what neighbors do." He was already reaching for another log, splitting it with the same easy competence. "Besides, I would feel poorly knowing you were cold this winter when I have more wood than I need." They fell into a rhythm then, with Jackson doing the splitting while Willa stacked the pieces against the side of her cabin. As they worked, they talked. She learned that he had grown up on the ranch, that his mother had died when he was young, that he ran cattle and bred horses. He had a way of asking questions that made her want to answer, and before she knew it, she was telling him about her life before Arizona, about growing up in Missouri and meeting Thomas Davidson when she was 18. "We came out here for a fresh start," she said, stacking another armload of wood. Thomas had dreams of farming, of building something of our own. We had been here less than a year when he died. That must have been hard, being so new to the territory with no family nearby. "I have considered going back east," Willa admitted, "but I have nothing there either. My parents died of cholera 5 years ago. I have a sister in St. Louis, but she has troubles enough of her own with 4 children and a husband who drinks. This land is mine, or will be if I can prove it up. Leaving feels like admitting defeat." Jackson paused in his work, leaning on the axe handle. "Staying here alone will not be easy. Tucson is growing, but it is still rough country. Have you had any trouble with anyone bothering you?" "A few men from town have come around with offers to buy the land for a fraction of what it is worth. One of them suggested I might need a husband to help me manage." Her voice was tight with anger at the memory. "I sent them all away." "Good," Jackson said firmly. "You should not have to sell what is yours, and you certainly should not have to marry some opportunist looking to profit from your situation." He returned to splitting wood, his swing steady and rhythmic. "But the offer of help stands. If anyone gives you trouble, you send word to my ranch." "I will come." The sincerity in his voice made Willa's throat tight. She had been alone for so long, holding everything together through sheer stubborn will. Having someone offer help without expecting anything in return felt like a gift she had not known she needed. They worked through the afternoon, and by the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Jackson had split more wood than Willa could have managed in 2 weeks. Her woodpile had grown considerably, though she knew it still was not enough for the whole winter. "I will be back tomorrow with a wagon load from my property," Jackson said as he prepared to leave. "And I will bring my hired man to help. We will get you properly set up." "I do not know how to thank you," Willa said. "No thanks needed. But if you insist, you could offer me some water before I ride back. I have worked up quite a thirst." Willa fetched him a dipper of cool water from her well, watching as he drank. When he handed the dipper back, their fingers brushed, and she felt a flutter of something she had not experienced in a long time. She pushed the feeling away, telling herself not to be foolish. True to his word, Jackson returned the next morning with a wagon loaded with seasoned timber, and a weathered Mexican man he introduced as Roberto, who had worked on the Xavier Ranch for 20 years. The 2 men worked with practiced efficiency, and Jackson kept his promise to teach Willa the proper way to split wood so she could maintain her supply. "The trick is in your stance," he explained, positioning himself behind her to adjust her grip on the axe handle. His hands were warm over hers, and Willa found herself acutely aware of his presence, the smell of leather and sage that clung to him. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. You want to feel stable. When he stepped back and she tried again, the log split clean through. The rush of accomplishment made her grin. "There you go," Jackson said, and the approval in his voice warmed her more than it should have. They worked for 3 days straight, Jackson and Roberto arriving each morning and staying until the sun began to set. Willa insisted on providing meals, and they ate together at the rough-hewn table Thomas had built their first month in the cabin. Roberto was full of stories about the territory, about the Apache Wars and the Silver Strikes and the gradual push of civilization into the desert. Jackson added his own observations, and Willa found herself laughing more than she had in months. On the 3rd evening, after Roberto had ridden back to the ranch, Jackson lingered as Willa walked him to his horse. "I think you have enough wood now to last through the winter and well into spring," he said. "Roberto knows timber, and he says what we have stacked should see you through." "I cannot ever repay you for this kindness," Willa said. "I told you, no repayment needed." Jackson hesitated, his hand on his saddle horn. "But I would like to call on you if you would permit it, not out of pity or duty, but because I would like to know you better. I have enjoyed these past days more than any I can remember in a long while." Willa's heart hammered in her chest. She had suspected he might have some interest beyond neighborly kindness, had caught him watching her when he thought she was not looking. But hearing him say, it plainly made it real in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. "People will talk," she said quietly. "It has only been 6 months since Thomas died. Let them talk. I have never put much stock in gossip." Jackson's green eyes were steady on hers. "But I will not press if you are not ready. I just wanted you to know my intentions are honorable." Willa thought about the long, empty evenings in her cabin, the silence that pressed down on her like a weight. She thought about Jackson's kindness, the way he had helped without making her feel small or incapable. She thought about the flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. "You may call on me," she said. "I would like that." The smile that spread across Jackson's face was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. "I will come by Sunday afternoon if that suits you. We could ride out to the canyon if you like. It is beautiful this time of year." After he left, Willa stood in her doorway and looked at the towering stacks of firewood that now lined the side of her cabin and filled the lean-to Thomas had started but never finished. Jackson had not just chopped enough to get her through a rough patch. He had cut and hauled and stacked enough seasoned timber to last her through the entire year, maybe longer. It was the act of a man who cared, who wanted to ensure she would be safe and warm no matter what came. The realization made her eyes sting with tears, but they were not tears of grief this time. They were something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like hope. Sunday arrived bright and clear, the kind of October day that made the desert beautiful instead of harsh. Willa had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on her best dress, a dark blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She braided her blonde hair and pinned it up, then spent 20 minutes talking herself out of being nervous. When Jackson arrived, he was cleaned up and clearly had made an effort himself, wearing a pressed shirt and a vest she suspected he saved for church and special occasions. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride, knowing she did not have a horse of her own. "Her name is Daisy," Jackson said, helping Willa mount. "She is the sweetest-tempered horse I own. You will be safe with her." They rode out toward the canyon country north of Tucson, where the land rose and folded into dramatic formations of red rock. Jackson kept his horse close to hers, pointing out landmarks and wildlife as they went. He showed her a spring where clear water bubbled up from the rocks, and a stand of cottonwoods that would turn gold in another few weeks. "This is my favorite part of the territory," Jackson said as they dismounted to walk through a narrow canyon. "It feels untouched out here, like the land is still wild and free." "It is beautiful," Willa agreed, running her hand along the smooth rock wall. "Thomas was always so focused on making the farm work that we never explored much. I had forgotten how much I enjoy riding. You are welcome to come out here whenever you like, and you should have a horse of your own. A woman living alone needs reliable transportation." "I cannot afford a horse right now. I have several that need riding. You would actually be doing me a favor by exercising one of them. Daisy here does not get ridden enough. She could use regular work." Willa gave him a long look. "You are very good at making charity sound like something else." Jackson had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Is it working?" Despite herself, Willa laughed. Perhaps a little, but I will consider the horse alone, nothing more. When I can afford to buy her properly, I will." They found a shaded spot beneath a palo verde tree and sat on the sun-warmed rocks, sharing the canteen Jackson had brought. The conversation flowed easily, moving from topic to topic without awkwardness. Willa found herself telling him things she had not spoken of in years, about her childhood dreams and her fears about the future. Jackson listened with the same focused attention he gave to everything, never dismissing her concerns, but offering thoughts and perspectives she had not considered. "You are stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said when she confessed her doubts about making it on her own. "You have survived 6 months already, and you will survive the next 6 months and the 6 months after that. And you do not have to do it alone anymore, not if you do not want to." "Why are you being so kind to me?" Willa asked. "You do not know me, not really." Jackson was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "My father used to say that you can tell the measure of a person by watching how they handle hardship. I watched you out there struggling with that firewood, your hands bleeding, exhausted and alone, but you kept trying. You did not give up. That told me everything I needed to know about your character." He turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "And if I am being honest, I felt something the moment I saw you, like recognizing someone I had been looking for without knowing I was searching." Willa's heart was racing. "I felt it too," she admitted quietly. "It frightened me. Does it still frighten you? A little, but not as much as the thought of letting fear keep me from taking a chance." Jackson reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers. "I will not rush you. We can take all the time you need, but I want you to know that what I feel is real. This is not some passing fancy." They sat together as the afternoon light shifted and changed, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. When Jackson finally walked her back to the horses, he helped her mount with a steadiness that made her feel safe. The ride back to her homestead was quiet but comfortable, and when they arrived, Jackson dismounted to help her down. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her from the saddle, and for a moment they stood close enough that Willa could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. Her breath caught, and she thought he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back with visible effort. "May I come calling again?" he asked. "I would like that very much." Over the following weeks, Jackson became a regular presence in Willa's life. He came by twice a week, sometimes bringing fresh meat from hunting, other times just his company. They rode out to explore more of the territory, and he taught her things about surviving in the desert that Thomas had never learned. How to find water by watching where birds flew at dawn, which plants could be eaten and which would make her sick. How to read the signs of changing weather in the sky, but it was not just practical knowledge he shared. He brought her books from his ranch, having noticed her small collection of worn volumes. They read together in the evenings, trading a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets back and forth, and Willa discovered that, beneath his cowboy exterior, Jackson had been educated by his mother before she died and had continued reading throughout his life. "My mother believed that a person should feed their mind as well as their body," Jackson explained one evening as they sat on Willa's porch watching the sunset. "She made sure I could read and write and cipher before she passed. Said it did not matter if I was going to spend my life ranching, I should still know there was a wider world out there." She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. She would have liked you, I think. You have the same kind of strength she had, the quiet kind that does not need to make a lot of noise about itself. As October gave way to November, the weather began to cool, and Willa was grateful for the towering stacks of firewood that surrounded her cabin. Every time she fed a log into her stove, She thought of Jackson and the 3 days he had spent ensuring she would be warm. It was more than just firewood he had given her. It was security, protection against the uncertain winter ahead. It was a tangible demonstration that someone cared whether she lived or died, whether she was comfortable or suffering. The people of Tucson had noticed Jackson's attentions, of course. When Willa went to town for supplies, she could feel the weight of speculative stares and hear the whispers that followed her down the dusty streets. Some of it was disapproving. Respectable widows were supposed to mourn for at least a year, preferably longer. But there was also a thread of envy from the unmarried women, and approval from the older matrons who valued practical considerations over empty propriety. Let them talk, her nearest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Potter, told her firmly when Willa mentioned the gossip. You are young and alone, and Jackson Xavier is a good man. If my Henry had died and left me alone when I was your age, I would not have waited a year to accept help from a decent man. Life is hard enough without making it harder out of false pride. The first cold snap arrived in mid-November, and Willa woke to find frost coating the sparse grass around her cabin. She built up her fire and made coffee, thinking about the winter ahead. She had enough food put by, thanks to Jackson bringing her venison and helping her harvest what remained of her struggling garden. She had firewood stacked to the rafters of her lean-to and piled against every wall. She had a good horse to ride, even if she still insisted it was only alone. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she might actually survive this. Jackson arrived that afternoon with Roberto and another ranch hand, driving a wagon loaded with tools and lumber. Your roof needs patching before the winter rains come, Jackson announced, climbing down from the wagon seat. Roberto noticed some gaps in the shingles last time we were here. I brought materials to fix it properly. Jackson Xavier, you cannot keep doing this, Willa protested, even as her heart swelled with gratitude. I can and I will. Besides, this is selfish on my part. I will not sleep well knowing you might have rain pouring through your roof come January. He grinned at her, that boyish smile that made her stomach flip. Let me have my peace of mind, Willa. They spent the day on her roof, and Willa insisted on climbing up to help despite Jackson's protests. Working alongside him and his men, learning how to spot weak shingles and replace them properly, she felt capable in a way she had not since Thomas died. Jackson never treated her like she was fragile or incompetent. He showed her how to do things and then trusted her to do them, only stepping in if she asked for help. You are a quick learner, he said as they worked side by side. By spring, you will be able to handle most repairs yourself. I hope I will not need to handle them myself, Willa said quietly. Jackson paused, a hammer in his hand, and looked at her. What do you mean? Willa took a breath, gathering her courage. She had been thinking about this for weeks now, about what was growing between them and where it might lead. I mean that I hope by spring, I might not be living here alone anymore. Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes, followed by something that looked like joy. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I have come to care for you very much, Jackson Xavier. More than I thought possible when you first showed up and started splitting my firewood. And I think you care for me too, and I am tired of dancing around what is happening between us, because of what people might think. Jackson set down his hammer and moved closer to her, careful on the sloped roof. I do care for you, more than I can put into words. I have been trying to court you properly, to give you time, but Willa, I have been in love with you since that first day. Watching you refuse to give up, refuse to quit no matter how hard it got, I knew you were the woman I wanted beside me for the rest of my life. Then why have you not kissed me yet? Willa asked, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Because I wanted to be sure it was what you wanted, because I did not want you to feel pressured or obligated." Jackson reached up to cup her face, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek. "But if you are telling me you are ready, then nothing would make me happier." When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, tentative and sweet. But when Willa responded, winding her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and a future neither of them had dared to hope for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is soon and people will talk, but I do not care. I want to take care of you, not because you cannot take care of yourself, but because it would be my honor to stand beside you. Marry me, Willa." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Roberto called up from the ground, asking a question about materials, and they broke apart, both grinning like fools. They finished the roof work in record time, and after Roberto and the other ranch hand left, Jackson stayed for dinner. They sat together at Willa's table, making plans for their future. "I do not want you to give up this land," Jackson said. "We can keep it as part of our holdings, maybe plant hay or run some cattle on it. Your cabin can be a line shack, or we can rent it to someone who needs it. But it is yours, and it should stay yours." "I would like that," Willa said. "Thomas and I had dreams for this place. It feels right to hold on to it, to make something good come from all his hard work. We can get married as soon as you want. This week if you like, or we can wait until spring if you prefer a larger celebration." Willa considered. Part of her wanted to wait to do things properly, but a larger part of her was tired of being alone, tired of the empty nights and the weight of solitude. "Soon," she decided. "Before Christmas. I do not need a big wedding, just something simple with a few friends to witness." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Tucson, with Roberto and Mrs. Potter standing as witnesses. Willa wore a new dress that Jackson had insisted on buying, made of deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Jackson wore a suit that had belonged to his father, altered to fit his broader shoulders. The ceremony was short and simple, but when the minister pronounced them man and wife and Jackson kissed her, Willa felt like the luckiest woman in the territory. The wedding breakfast was held at the hotel in town, and despite Willa's desire for something small, half of Tucson seemed to show up to wish them well. It turned out that Jackson was well liked and respected, and people were genuinely happy to see him settled. If some of the older women sniffed about the unseemly haste of the marriage, they were drowned out by the well-wishers who knew a good match when they saw one. Jackson took Willa home to the Xavier Ranch that afternoon, and she got her first real look at the place that would be her new home. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, a sprawling adobe structure with thick walls that would stay cool in summer and warm in winter. It had been built by Jackson's grandfather and added onto by his father, and while it was clearly a bachelor household in need of a woman's touch, the bones of it were solid and good. "It is not much," Jackson said as he carried her over the threshold, "but it is home. Or it will be once you make it yours." "It is wonderful," Willa said honestly, looking around the spacious main room with its massive fireplace and comfortable furniture. "I can see us being happy here," and they were happy. The first months of their marriage were a revelation to Willa. She had cared for Thomas, had built a comfortable partnership with him, but what she felt for Jackson was something else entirely. It was passion and friendship, and a deep abiding love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Jackson was affectionate and demonstrative in a way Thomas had never been, always reaching for her hand or stealing kisses when they passed each other during the day. He also treated her as a partner in the ranch operations, teaching her about the business and asking her opinion on decisions. Willa discovered she had a head for numbers and took over the ranch bookkeeping, organizing records that had been haphazard at best under Jackson's care. She also threw herself into improving the house, sewing curtains, and making the place feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between long days of work. Winter passed in a blur of activity and happiness. The firewood Jackson had cut and stacked at her old cabin remained untouched through the cold months, a monument to the act of kindness that had brought them together. In February, Jackson hired a family newly arrived from Texas to live in the cabin and work a portion of the land, with an agreement that they could buy it outright after 5 years if they chose. The arrangement gave the struggling family a chance to establish themselves while ensuring Willa's property was cared for. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers that painted the desert in impossible colors. Willa discovered she was pregnant in April, and Jackson's joy at the news was almost comical in its intensity. He immediately became overprotective, trying to keep her from any task more strenuous than sitting quietly in the shade. "I am growing a baby, not dying of consumption," Willa finally told him in exasperation. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I can still ride and work and live my life." I know. I just want to take care of you. You do take care of me. You have since the day we met. But taking care of me does not mean wrapping me in cotton wool. It means trusting me to know my own limits." Jackson pulled her into his arms, resting a hand on her still flat belly. "You are right, I am sorry. I just love you so much, both of you. The thought of anything happening to either of you terrifies me. Nothing is going to happen. We are going to have a healthy baby, and we are going to raise them to be strong and capable, just like their parents." Their son was born in late December, arriving just before Christmas in a snowstorm that blanketed the desert in rare white. The birth was hard, and there were moments when Jackson feared he might lose Willa, but she fought her way through with the same determination she had shown splitting firewood that first day. When the midwife finally placed the red-faced, squalling infant in Willa's arms, Jackson wept openly. They named him James, after Jackson's father, and he was perfect. Dark-haired like Jackson but with Willa's blue eyes, he had a strong cry and an even stronger grip. Jackson was instantly smitten, spending hours just watching the baby sleep or trying to soothe him when he fussed. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Jackson said one night as they stood over James's cradle. "I thought I knew what love was when I married you, but this is different, bigger somehow." "I know," Willa agreed, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "It is terrifying and wonderful all at once." The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved the ranch and the animals and following his father everywhere. Willa gave birth to a daughter when James was 3, a golden-haired little girl they named Julia, who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. Another son, Joseph, came 2 years after that, completing their family. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Jackson's skill with horses and cattle combined with Willa's business sense to create an operation that was both successful and respected throughout the territory. They added to their holdings, buying adjacent land as it became available, but they never sold Willa's original homestead. It remained a symbol of where they had started, of the struggles that had brought them together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Willa back to that homestead for the first time in years. The family living there had moved on, bought their own land closer to town, and the cabin stood empty. The firewood Jackson had cut all those years ago was long gone, burned or rotted, but the lean-to still stood, and the roof he had patched had kept the structure sound. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked as they stood together looking at the small cabin. Saying yes to me so quickly. Marrying me when people said it was too soon. Willa turned to face him, this man who had come into her life when she needed him most and stayed to build a future beyond anything she could have imagined. Silver was starting to show in his dark hair now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, but he was still the handsomest man she had ever seen. More importantly, he was still the kindest, the one who had seen her struggling and offered help without making her feel small. Not for a single moment, she said. You saved my life that day, Jackson, not just by chopping firewood but by seeing me. Really seeing me, not as someone to pity or take advantage of, but as someone worth knowing, worth loving. I fell in love with your strength, Jackson said, pulling her close. Your refusal to give up even when everything seemed impossible. That was what drew me in, but I stayed for everything else. Your kindness and your courage and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. Your jokes are terrible, Willa agreed, smiling up at him. I know, but you laugh anyway. They stood together in the afternoon sun, two people who had found each other through chance and choice and the simple act of one person helping another in need. Around them, the desert bloomed with spring flowers, and in the distance, they could hear their children playing, their voices bright with joy. We should head back, Willa said eventually. Roberto will have his hands full watching all three of them. In a minute. I just want to stand here a little longer and remember how it all started. You struggling with that axe, me trying to find the courage to offer help without offending your pride. I am glad you found that courage. So am I. Best decision I ever made stopping that day. Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house came into view, lights glowing in the windows, and Willa could see Roberto on the porch with the children. James was probably pestering him with questions about horses, while Julia tried to show off whatever new skill she had mastered that day. Joseph would be toddling around getting into everything, his chubby hands reaching for whatever caught his interest. It was a good life, Willa thought. Better than she had ever dreamed possible during those dark days after Thomas died. She had her health, her children, and a husband who loved her deeply and showed it every day in 1,000 small ways. The ranch was prosperous. Her original homestead was being cared for, and she had built friendships in the community that sustained her. As they dismounted, and the children came running to greet them, James chattering about his day and Julia demanding to be picked up, Willa caught Jackson's eye over their heads. He winked at her, and she felt the familiar flutter of love and desire that had never faded despite years of marriage and the daily grind of ranch life. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Jackson and Willa sat together on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It had become their habit over the years, this quiet time together at the end of each day. Sometimes they talked about the ranch or the children or their plans for the future. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, content to be together. I was thinking, Jackson said, breaking the peaceful quiet, that we should teach the children the story of how we met. About the firewood and your determination not to quit. Why is that important? Willa asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Because I want them to understand that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the hardest struggles. You were at your lowest point when I found you, but you did not give up. You kept fighting, kept trying, and that struggle led to this. He gestured to encompass the ranch, the house, their life together. All of this started because you refused to quit and because I was willing to help. Those are lessons worth passing down. You are right, Willa said. We will tell them. We will make sure they know that strength is not just about being tough or independent. Sometimes it is about accepting help when you need it and offering help when you can give it." Jackson pulled her closer, and Willa rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. She thought about that October day 10 years ago, about her blistered hands and aching back, about the despair that had threatened to drown her. She thought about Jackson appearing like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to say, offering help with no expectation of anything in return. The Firewood had been just the beginning. In the years since, Jackson had continued to show his love through actions both large and small. He had given her security and partnership, passion and friendship, children and a home filled with laughter. But it all traced back to that first act of simple kindness, the choice to help someone who needed it. "I love you," Willa said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "I love you too," Jackson murmured against her lips. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. The years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. James grew tall and serious, showing an early aptitude for working with horses that made his father proud. Julia proved to have her mother's head for numbers and her father's way with animals, a combination that suggested she would be a formidable rancher in her own right someday. Joseph was the dreamer of the family, always asking questions about the wider world and begging Jackson to read to him from the books Willa had collected over the years. When James turned 15, Jackson took him to Willa's old homestead and told him the story of how his parents had met. He showed him where the firewood had been stacked, where his mother had struggled with the axe, where Jackson had first felt the stirring of love that would change both their lives. "Your mother could have given up," Jackson told his son. "She could have sold the land and gone back east, could have married one of those opportunists who came sniffing around looking to profit from her situation. But she held on. She fought for what was hers, even when it seemed impossible." "And you helped her," James said. "I did what any decent person should do when they see someone struggling. I offered help. But your mother did not just accept charity. She worked beside me, learned what I had to teach, and then built on it. She took what I gave her and made something even better." "Is that why you never sold this place? Because it is where you met?" "Partly. But also because I wanted you children to have a reminder that where you start does not have to be where you end up. Your mother started here, alone and scared and barely surviving, but she did not let that define her. She fought her way to something better." The lesson stuck with James, and he carried it into his own life. As the children grew and eventually began to build their own futures, they each took something different from their parents' story. James inherited his mother's determination and his father's work ethic, eventually expanding the ranch operations into new territory. Julia, who had always been fascinated by her mother's business acumen, studied bookkeeping and finance, becoming one of the few women in the territory to run her own accounting firm. Joseph, the dreamer, became a teacher, helping to establish schools throughout Arizona Territory as it grew and developed toward eventual statehood. Jackson and Willa watched their children flourish with pride and satisfaction. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that drew friends and neighbors from miles around. The house rang with laughter and music, and Willa found herself thinking about how far they had come from that desperate October day when Jackson had first appeared in her life. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, finding her alone for a moment on the porch. "About firewood," Willa said, and laughed at his confused expression. "About how you changed my entire life by stopping to help, about how different things would be if you had just ridden past that day." "I could never have ridden past," Jackson said seriously. "Something in me recognized something in you. I knew, even before we spoke, that you were important, that we were meant to find each other. Do you really believe in fate like that? I believe that sometimes we are in the right place at the right time, and what we do with that opportunity defines the rest of our lives. I was in the right place, and I made the choice to stop and help. You made the choice to accept that help and to take a chance on me. Those choices led to all of this. He gestured to the party inside, to their children and grandchildren starting to arrive, to the prosperous ranch spread out around them. As evening fell and the celebration continued, Jackson and Willa slipped away to watch the sunset from their favorite spot on the property, a small rise that gave a view of the ranch in one direction and the mountains in the other. They had watched countless sunsets from this spot over the years, marking the passage of time and the changes in their lives. "No regrets?" Jackson asked, as he always did. "Not a single one," Willa answered, as she always did, and it was true. The path from that struggling widow chopping firewood to this moment had not always been easy. There had been challenges and setbacks, years when the weather did not cooperate, or the market for cattle dropped, or illness threatened. But through it all, they had faced everything together, stronger as a unit than either could have been alone. When Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Jackson and Willa were among the old-timers who had seen the territory grow from rough frontier to settled civilization. Their children were grown with families of their own, and grandchildren ran through the ranch house with the same energy their parents had shown decades before. Jackson retired from the day-to-day running of the ranch, turning operations over to James while he and Willa enjoyed a slower pace of life. They traveled some, visiting Julia in Phoenix and Joseph at the school he ran in Flagstaff. But they always came home to the ranch, to the life they had built together. On a warm spring evening in 1915, they rode out together to Willa's old homestead one last time. New tenants were living there now, a young couple with big dreams and limited resources who reminded Willa sharply of herself and Thomas all those years ago. She had given them the same chance Jackson had given her, offering reasonable terms and support as they worked to establish themselves. "Do you think they will make it?" Jackson asked as they watched smoke curl from the cabin chimney. "I think they have a chance," Willa said. "They have what matters most. They love each other, they are willing to work hard, and they are not afraid to ask for help when they need it. Like someone else I knew once." "Like both of us," Willa corrected. "You were not afraid to offer help, and I was not too proud to accept it. That was what made the difference." They rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of companionship. The lights of home appeared in the distance, and Willa felt the familiar warmth of gratitude for everything this life had given her. That night, Jackson had trouble breathing, and by morning it was clear something was seriously wrong. The doctor came from Tucson and diagnosed a weak heart, warning that Jackson needed rest and limited activity. Jackson, predictably, ignored most of the doctor's orders, continuing to involve himself in ranch operations and refusing to slow down. "I am not going to spend my last years sitting in a chair watching life happen around me," he told Willa when she tried to get him to take it easier. "I would rather have a few good years than many boring ones." Willa understood, even as she worried. She had fallen in love with Jackson's vitality, his enthusiasm for life and work. Asking him to give that up would be like asking him to stop being himself. They had 3 more good years together. Jackson saw James's son, his first grandson, grow into a talented horseman. He walked Julia down the aisle when she finally married at 38, having waited to find a man who respected her independence and intelligence. He attended Joseph's wedding to a fellow teacher, and delighted in the intellectual conversations his son and daughter-in-law brought to family gatherings. On a clear October morning in 1918, Jackson died peacefully in his sleep with Willa beside him. They had been married 43 years, and in all that time, his love had never wavered. Willa grieved deeply but without bitterness. She had been given a gift, all those years with a man who loved her completely and showed it every day through his actions and his words. The funeral drew people from all over Arizona. Jackson had touched many lives through his fairness and generosity, and the church in Tucson overflowed with mourners. But it was the private burial at the ranch, just family and close friends, that meant the most to Willa. They laid Jackson to rest on a hillside overlooking the land he had loved, and Willa stood by his grave with her children and grandchildren around her, remembering. "Tell us the story, Mama," Julia said quietly. "About how you met Papa, about the firewood." So Willa told them, standing in the sunshine on that October day so much like the one when Jackson had first ridden into her life. She told them about her struggles and her desperation, about Jackson appearing like Providence and offering help without expecting anything in return. She told them about the 3 days he spent cutting and hauling and stacking firewood, ensuring she would be warm through the winter. She told them about falling in love and building a life together through hard work and partnership and unwavering devotion. "Your father saw someone struggling and chose to help," Willa finished. "That simple choice changed both our lives. It led to all of you, to this ranch, to everything we built together. Remember that. Remember that kindness matters, that helping others matters, that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences." Willa lived another 12 years, watching her grandchildren grow and welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. She stayed active in ranch operations well into her 70s, her sharp mind and careful management ensuring the family business continued to prosper. But she never remarried, never even considered it. She had had her great love, and nothing could replace or replicate what she and Jackson had shared. On the anniversary of Jackson's death each year, Willa would ride out to her old homestead and spend a few hours there, remembering. She would walk around the property, noting the changes and improvements made by various tenants over the years. But she always spent the longest time standing where the woodpile had been, where Jackson had first shown her the depth of his character through the simple act of helping someone in need. When Willa died in 1930 at the age of 77, she was surrounded by 3 generations of family in the ranch house she and Jackson had made into a home. Her last words were, "Tell Jackson I am coming," and when she drew her final breath, she did so with a smile on her face. They buried her beside Jackson on the hillside, and the whole state seemed to mourn. Willa had become something of a legend in Arizona, one of the pioneer women who had helped tame the frontier and build civilization in the desert. But her children and grandchildren remembered her not as a legend, but as a woman who had loved deeply and lived fully, who had faced incredible hardship and come through it stronger, who had built something lasting through courage and hard work and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, and eventually growing into one of the largest and most successful operations in the state. Willa's old homestead was eventually donated to the state as a historical site, a preserved example of early homesteading in the Arizona Territory. Visitors walked through the small cabin and learned the story of Willa and Jackson, of how a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that shaped a family and helped build a state. And though the original firewood was long gone, turned to ash decades before, the story of it lived on. It became a family legend, passed from generation to generation, A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with something as simple and profound as one person seeing another's struggle and choosing to help. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the ranch or the prosperity or the legacy of descendants who carried the Xavier and Davidson names into the future. What mattered was that Jackson had seen Willa struggling with firewood and had chopped enough to last her through the year. What mattered was that a simple act of kindness had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a love that endured beyond death and lived on in the memories and stories of everyone they had touched. And so the story continued, told and retold, a testament to the power of helping those in need and the extraordinary things that can grow from a single moment of compassion. It was a story of the Wild West, of hardship and perseverance, of two people finding each other against all odds. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple, the kind that reminded everyone who heard it that true love still existed, that it was worth fighting for, and that sometimes it arrived in the most unexpected ways at exactly the moment when you needed it most.